In a Napa Valley estate office, a corporate lawyer was about to witness her stepmother's fatal mistake. What started as a routine will reading took a shocking turn when they came face to face with document destruction and elder abuse. Jessica Martinez wasn't your typical grieving daughter. For 6 months, she had been building a federal fraud case, known for her methodical investigation skills. When she encountered Catherine burning her father's authentic will, she had no idea she was exposing a multi-state criminal enterprise. Jessica's evidence would lead to a 25-year federal prison sentence and justice for multiple elderly victims. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Jessica Martinez had driven the winding roads of Napa Valley countless times, but today the familiar landscape felt foreign. The October sun cast long shadows across the vineyards, and the scent of fermenting grapes hung heavy in the air, a smell that had once meant home, comfort, family. Now it carried the weight of loss and the bitter taste of unspoken resentments. The Martinez estate sprawled across 50 acres of prime wine country, its Spanish colonial architecture a testament to 3 decades of Roberto Martinez's vision and determination. Jessica parked her rental car in the circular drive, noting how Catherine's white Porsche gleamed in the afternoon light, polished and pristine, like everything about her stepmother. Through the tall windows of her father's office, she could see movement. Attorney William Hayes was already there, his weathered briefcase open on the mahogany desk where Roberto had conducted business for over 20 years. The walls were lined with awards and photographs chronicling the Martinez winery's rise from a modest family operation to one of Napa's most respected boutique vineyards. Catherine Walsh Martinez stood near the fireplace, her black Chanel suit impeccable despite the circumstances. At 42, she possessed the kind of polished beauty that pharmaceutical sales training had taught her to weaponize: perfectly styled auburn hair, manicured nails, and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She turned as Jessica entered, her expression carefully arranged in grieving widow composure. "Jessica, darling," Catherine's voice carried just the right note of sorrowful warmth. "I'm so glad you could make it." William was just preparing to begin. Hayes looked up from his papers, his 60-year-old frame seeming smaller than Jessica remembered. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his usually steady hands showed a slight tremor. 20 years of serving as the Martinez family attorney had aged him, but today he appeared genuinely distressed. "Jessica," he nodded formally, "my condolences again on your father's passing. Roberto he was a good man." The hesitation in his voice made Jessica's chest tighten. She'd known William Hayes since childhood. He'd been Roberto's trusted advisor, golf partner, and friend. That careful, professional distance felt wrong, dangerous even. Marcus sat in the corner chair he'd claimed during childhood visits, though at 16 he'd outgrown both the seat and the awkward positioning it forced him into. Catherine's son from her previous marriage had always been caught between worlds, too young to understand adult complexities, too smart to miss the undercurrents. His dark eyes, so much like his adoptive father's, tracked between the adults with growing unease. "Shall we begin?" Hayes cleared his throat and reached for the bound document on the desk. Roberto's will There were some recent updates made during his final illness, changes he felt were necessary given his circumstances. Jessica's legal training kicked in immediately. Updates during final illness. Red flags began waving in her mind, but she kept her expression neutral. "What kind of updates, William?" Catherine moved closer to the desk, her hand resting on its polished surface with proprietary familiarity. "Your father was very concerned about the future of the winery, Jessica. He wanted to ensure it would be properly managed by someone who understood the business." "Someone who understood the business." Jessica repeated the words carefully, noting how Catherine's fingers drummed silently against the wood. A tell she'd observed during Roberto's final months. Catherine's hand moved when she was calculating, planning, manipulating. Hayes began reading in the formal cadence required by law, but Jessica barely heard the opening legal language. Her attention focused on Catherine's face, watching for To my beloved wife Catherine, Hayes continued, his voice growing more strained, I leave the Martinez estate in its entirety, including all winery operations, real estate holdings, investment portfolios, and liquid assets, valued at approximately $12 million. Passivnetwait Enzedo. The words hit Jessica like a physical blow. 12 million! Everything. The winery her father had built from nothing, the house where she'd grown up, the legacy of 3 decades of backbreaking work, all of it going to a woman who'd known Roberto for less than 3 years. And to my daughter Jessica, Hayes's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, I leave my personal library and the sum of $50,000, with hopes that she will understand my decision and find peace in her own successful career. $50,000. Jessica's legal salary paid more than that in 4 months. She'd helped Roberto through every major business decision for the past decade, had defended the winery against corporate buyout attempts, had structured the very investment portfolios now being handed to Catherine. I don't understand. Jessica's voice remained steady despite the rage building in her chest. Dad and I discussed the succession plan just 6 months ago. He wanted me to take over operations gradually, to preserve the family legacy. Catherine's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a flash of triumph quickly masked by concern. Jessica, your father's illness changed many things. He became very worried about the burden of managing such a complex operation. He felt you were better suited to your legal career. Worried about the burden? Jessica stood, her hands flat on the desk. I've been managing the legal aspects of this business since law school. I know every contract, every supplier agreement, every regulatory requirement. But you've never shown real interest in the day-to-day operations, Catherine said, her voice carrying a subtle edge now. You were always so focused on your career in San Francisco. Roberto felt I understood the local community better, the relationships that make a winery successful. Hayes was studying the document in his hands, his brow furrowed with what looked like confusion, rather than professional concentration. Jessica caught his expression and felt another alarm bell sound in her mind. William, when exactly were these changes made? The document is dated 6 weeks before Roberto's death, during his final hospitalization. He was heavily sedated during that period, Jessica said carefully. The oncologist had him on significant pain medication for the last 2 months. Catherine's laugh carried just a hint of steel. Your father was perfectly lucid when he made these decisions, Jessica. Just because you disagree with them doesn't mean they're invalid. Marcus shifted in his chair, drawing Jessica's attention. The teenager's face showed genuine confusion and growing distress. Mom, he said quietly, I thought Dad wanted Jessica to run the winery. He talked about it all the time, how proud he was that she understood both the business and legal sides. Catherine's mask slipped completely for just an instant, annoyance flashing across her features before she regained control. Marcus, your father said many things during his illness. What matters is what he put in writing. What he put in writing when he was dying and dependent on medications that affected his judgment, Jessica said, her attorney instincts fully engaged now. William, I'd like to see the original will, the one Roberto signed when he was healthy. Hayes's face went pale. His eyes darted to Catherine, then back to Jessica. That document was superseded by the newer version. But you would have kept copies. Standard practice requires. Jessica. Catherine's voice cut through the room like a blade. She moved to the fireplace, where a low fire crackled, despite the October warmth. Your father made his wishes clear. You can accept them gracefully, or you can make this difficult for everyone. She reached into Hayes's briefcase and withdrew a thick manila folder. Jessica recognized it immediately. Roberto's original estate documents, the ones they'd worked on together, the ones that left the winery to her with provisions for Catherine's financial security. But if you insist on questioning his judgment, Catherine continued, opening the folder, then perhaps we should eliminate any confusion. Jessica realized what was happening a split second before Catherine moved. Don't. But Catherine was already feeding the documents into the flames. Page after page of Roberto's original will curled and blackened, his authentic signatures disappearing into ash and smoke. There, Catherine said, brushing soot from her manicured fingers, Now there's no confusion about Roberto's true intentions. Hayes jumped to his feet, his professional composure completely shattered. Catherine, what have you done? Those were legal documents. Those were outdated papers that were only causing Jessica pain. Catherine's voice carried cold satisfaction now, her grieving widow mask completely abandoned. Roberto changed his mind about many things during his illness. He realized Jessica had never really cared about the winery, only about what she could get from it. That's a lie. Jessica's voice was deadly quiet, her legal training warring with 26 years of family dynamics and raw grief. Everything you just said is a lie. Catherine turned from the fireplace, flames reflecting in her eyes. Is it? When was the last time you visited? Really visited, not just for holidays or business meetings. Your father spent his final months wondering why his daughter was too busy for him. The accusation hit its mark because it carried just enough truth to wound. Jessica had been busy, building her career, managing complex corporate cases, trying to prove herself in a field dominated by men twice her age. But she'd called Roberto every week, had flown up for every medical appointment she could manage, had fought for his care when the insurance company tried to deny treatments. I was here when it mattered, Jessica said, but even to her own ears it sounded defensive. Marcus was staring at his mother with undisguised horror. Mom, why did you burn Dad's papers? He always said those documents were important. Marcus, you don't understand adult matters, Catherine snapped, her control slipping further. Your father was manipulated by people who pretended to care about him but really just wanted his money. People like his own daughter? Jessica's voice carried dangerous quiet now. Catherine laughed, the sound sharp and artificial. People like the daughter who visited twice during his final illness, who was too important to help him make arrangements, who couldn't be bothered to understand that he needed someone who actually loved him. Someone who loved him enough to isolate him from his family, someone who loved him enough to change his medication schedule so he was too confused to think clearly, someone who loved him enough to forge his signature on documents he never would have signed. The words hung in the air like smoke from the burning will. Hayes stared at Jessica with growing alarm, while Marcus's face went white. But Catherine's expression shifted into something predatory and satisfied. Careful, Jessica, she said softly. Grief can make people say things they'll regret, things that sound almost like accusations. Jessica studied her stepmother's face, the calculating eyes, the slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth, the way she stood with ownership over everything in the room. This wasn't grief-driven vindictiveness. This was triumph. Catherine had wanted Jessica to make accusations, had wanted her to sound desperate and vengeful, had burned the documents not to destroy evidence, but to provoke exactly this kind of emotional response. But what Catherine didn't understand was that Jessica Martinez wasn't just Roberto's grieving daughter. She was a corporate attorney who specialized in financial fraud. And she'd been building a case for months. Marcus's hand trembled as he watched the last fragments of his father's original will crumble into ash. The silence that followed Catherine's destructive display stretched like a held breath, broken only by the crackling of flames consuming decades of careful legal planning. Jessica reached for her briefcase with movements that were almost casual, her expression shifting from grief-stricken daughter to something far more dangerous. Catherine's satisfied smile faltered as Jessica withdrew a thick manila folder, its contents organized with the methodical precision of someone who built cases for a living. You know, Catherine, Jessica said, her voice carrying the measured calm of someone used to cross-examining hostile witnesses, I've been wondering for months when you'd finally drop the Grieving Widow Act. She opened the folder on the desk, revealing photocopied documents, financial statements, and what appeared to be forensic analysis reports. Hayes leaned forward instinctively, his legal training overriding his shock at the burned will. What you just destroyed, Jessica continued, laying out pages with systematic precision, were copies I had William make 6 months ago when I first noticed irregularities in Dad's accounts. Catherine's face went white. Irregularities? Transfers of funds from Dad's medical savings account to personal accounts he'd never opened. Insurance claims filed for treatments he never received. Prescription medications ordered in quantities far exceeding his actual needs. Jessica's fingers moved across the documents like a dealer laying out cards. All of it happening while you were his primary caregiver and held his power of attorney. Marcus stared at the papers, his voice barely above a whisper. Mom, what is she talking about? Catherine moved away from the fireplace, her polished composure cracking like ice under pressure. Jessica, your grief is making you paranoid. These are normal medical expenses. Are they? Jessica pulled out a highlighted bank statement. This transfer of $50,000 to an account in your maiden name, made the day after Dad's chemotherapy session when he was sedated for 18 hours. His signature on the authorization form. She produced a magnified photocopy. Different pen pressure, different angle, different tremor pattern than his actual handwriting. Hayes was studying the documents with growing alarm, his professional eye catching details that painted a disturbing picture. Jessica, how long have you been investigating this? Since March, when Dad's insurance company called me about a claim discrepancy. They'd received bills for treatments at a facility in Los Angeles on days when Dad was physically in his hospital bed here in Napa. Jessica's voice remained steady, but her eyes never left Catherine's face. That's when I started paying closer attention to his finances. Catherine's laugh sounded brittle now, desperate. You're twisting normal medical procedures into some kind of conspiracy theory. Roberto was confused during his illness. Confused enough to sign documents transferring ownership of his wine collection to your personal storage unit? Confused enough to authorize the sale of his vintage Porsche to a dealer who happens to be your ex-boyfriend from pharmaceutical sales? Jessica pulled out more documents, each one a carefully documented piece of a larger puzzle. Or maybe he was just confused enough to change his investment portfolios to list you as the sole beneficiary, replacing the education trust he'd established for Marcus. Marcus looked like he'd been slapped. What education trust? Hayes was reading over Jessica's shoulder now, his face growing graver with each page. Roberto established a $2 million education fund for Marcus in 2018. It was meant to cover college, graduate school, whatever path he chose. He looked at Catherine with dawning understanding. Catherine, where is that trust fund? Roberto decided Marcus didn't need such a large amount. He felt it would make him entitled. He felt nothing of the sort, Jessica interrupted, producing an audio recording device. Because I have his voice on tape, recorded during one of our phone calls in April, specifically talking about how proud he was of Marcus's academic achievements and how the trust fund would give him freedom to pursue any career. Catherine was backing toward the door now, her carefully constructed world collapsing around her. You recorded private conversations with your dying father? I recorded conversations with my father after his insurance company suggested someone might be committing fraud using his identity. Jessica's tone carried the authority of someone who'd spent years in courtrooms, standard practice when elder abuse is suspected. The words hung in the air like an indictment. Elder abuse. Federal crime. Prison time. Hayes was studying Catherine with new eyes, seeing past the polished exterior to something calculated and predatory. Catherine, these documents suggest systematic financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. The legal implications are severe, Jessica finished. Document forgery across state lines. Mail fraud involving insurance claims. Financial exploitation of an elderly person during medical treatment. She looked directly at Catherine. Any one of these charges carries federal jurisdiction. All of them together? She shrugged. We're talking about decades in federal prison. Marcus stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. This isn't real. Mom, tell them this isn't real. Catherine's mask had completely fallen away now, revealing something cold and desperate underneath. Marcus, your sister is trying to destroy our family because she's jealous. She never cared about Roberto, only about what she could inherit. Sister? Marcus's voice cracked. She's not trying to destroy anything. She's showing us evidence that you've been stealing from Dad this whole time. Evidence that can be misinterpreted, manipulated. Evidence that's been corroborated by 3 separate forensic accounting firms, Jessica said calmly. Evidence that's already been reviewed by the FBI's Financial Crimes Division in San Francisco. The room went silent except for the ticking of Roberto's antique desk clock. Catherine's face cycled through shock, rage, and finally a kind of cornered desperation that made everyone in the room take an unconscious step back. "You called the FBI?" Hayes's voice was barely audible. Jessica nodded. "Agent Sarah Chen has been reviewing the preliminary findings for 2 weeks. She's particularly interested in Catherine's employment history in pharmaceutical sales and her access to cancer treatment facilities throughout Northern California." Catherine's hand moved to her purse, and for a moment Jessica tensed, wondering if her stepmother might be desperate enough to run. But Catherine just stared at the documents spread across Roberto's desk, evidence of months of systematic theft and manipulation, carefully documented and legally unassailable. "What do you want?" Catherine asked finally, her voice hollow. Jessica looked at her stepmother, this woman who had isolated her father, stolen his money, forged his documents, and destroyed his final wishes. She thought about justice and revenge, about family and forgiveness, about the difference between legal victory and moral resolution. "I want," Jessica said quietly, "exactly what you took from him. Everything." Everything. The word seemed to echo in Roberto's office, carrying the weight of months of investigation and years of suppressed suspicion. Catherine's face had gone ashen, but Jessica wasn't finished dismantling her stepmother's carefully constructed world. She reached into her briefcase again, this time withdrawing an official-looking document with federal letterhead. "What you need to understand, Catherine, is that this stopped being a family matter the moment you crossed state lines with forged documents." Hayes leaned forward, squinting at the letterhead. "Is that?" "A preliminary finding letter from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division," Jessica confirmed. "Agent Sarah Chen specializes in elder abuse cases involving sophisticated fraud schemes. She's been very interested in your methodology." Catherine grabbed the edge of Roberto's desk for support. "You can't be serious. The FBI doesn't get involved in family disputes. They get involved when someone uses their pharmaceutical sales access to identify vulnerable cancer patients across multiple states," Jessica interrupted, her voice carrying the clinical precision of a prosecutor building a case. "They get especially interested when that same person has a documented history of targeting elderly men with significant assets. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." Marcus was staring at his mother with growing horror. "Mom, what is she talking about?" "What other men?" Jessica pulled out another file, this one considerably thicker. "Richard Pemberton, 73, prostate cancer. Married Catherine in 2015 after meeting her at his oncology clinic in Sacramento. Died 6 months later, leaving her his house and retirement savings." Catherine's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. "David Walsh, yes, the man whose name you still legally carry. 68, lung cancer. Another pharmaceutical sales connection. Another whirlwind marriage to a grateful patient. Another convenient death with a recently altered will." Hayes was studying the documents with the horrified fascination of someone watching a car accident unfold. "Jessica, how did you discover all this?" "Insurance fraud investigation databases are surprisingly thorough when you know how to search them." Jessica's tone remained matter-of-fact, but her eyes never left Catherine's face. "Agent Chen ran Catherine's employment records against cancer treatment facility databases across 3 states. The pattern is comprehensive." Catherine finally found her voice, though it came out as a whisper. "Those were legitimate relationships. I cared for those men." "You targeted them systematically," Jessica corrected. "Your pharmaceutical sales territory gave you access to patient information, treatment schedules, family dynamics. You could identify wealthy, isolated men whose judgment was compromised by illness and grief." Marcus sank back into his chair, his teenage face struggling to process the magnitude of what he was learning. "Dad, wasn't your first husband?" "Your father loved Roberto," Jessica said gently, addressing Marcus while keeping her legal focus on Catherine. "That part was real. But Catherine, you chose him because he fit your victim profile perfectly. Wealthy widower, advanced cancer, Adult daughter living out of state, minimal family interference with your access and control. Hayes was shaking his head slowly, pieces of a puzzle falling into place. The rush to update the will during Roberto's final illness. The insistence on privacy during his medical appointments. Catherine, you isolated him from everyone who might have questioned your influence. I protected him, Catherine said desperately. Jessica was too busy with her career to care about his daily needs. His daily needs, like the pain medication you were controlling? Jessica produced another document. Dr. Hoffman's notes indicate Roberto was requesting his daughter's contact information during appointments, but somehow those messages never reached me. They also show discrepancies between prescribed dosages and what Roberto reported receiving. Catherine's composure cracked further. Doctors make mistakes. Record-keeping isn't always perfect, which is why Agent Chen has requested a full audit of Roberto's medical records, pharmacy dispensing logs, and your access to controlled substances through your pharmaceutical connections. Jessica's voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had thought several moves ahead. Federal drug trafficking charges carry even heavier sentences than financial fraud. The room fell silent except for the soft crackling of the fireplace, where the ashes of Roberto's original will still glowed among the embers. Catherine stared at those ashes as if they represented the destruction of more than just legal documents, the end of a carefully planned life built on exploitation and manipulation. Hayes cleared his throat nervously. Jessica, what exactly is the FBI planning to do? Agent Chen is driving up from San Francisco tomorrow morning. She'll want to interview everyone who was present here today, examine Roberto's financial records, and formally begin building the federal case. Jessica paused, studying Catherine's increasingly desperate expression. Unless, of course, Catherine would prefer to cooperate fully with the investigation and make restitution to all her victims. Catherine's laugh came out brittle and sharp. Cooperate? You want me to confess to crimes I didn't commit? I want you to acknowledge what we both know you did, Jessica replied evenly. The evidence is overwhelming, Catherine. Your choice is whether to face these charges as a cooperative witness or as a defendant fighting a case you cannot win. Marcus looked between his mother and Jessica, his young face showing the strain of loyalties being torn apart. What happens to me? Jessica's expression softened as she addressed her half-brother. You're a minor, Marcus. None of this is your fault. Whatever Catherine decides, you'll be protected. Catherine's eyes flashed with something dangerous. Don't you dare try to turn my son against me. Marcus, we're leaving, now. But Marcus remained seated, staring at the evidence spread across his father's desk. For the first time in his life, he was seeing his mother clearly, not as the devoted caregiver she portrayed herself to be, but as someone capable of systematic deception and exploitation. I want to hear what Agent Chen has to say, he said quietly. Catherine stared at her son in shock, realizing that her carefully constructed world was collapsing from within as well as without. The FBI was coming, the evidence was overwhelming, and now even Marcus was beginning to question everything she'd taught him to believe about family loyalty and trust. Catherine's face cycled through shock, rage, and something approaching panic as Marcus's quiet defiance settled over the room like smoke from the burned documents. She reached for her purse with movements that had become increasingly erratic, her polished pharmaceutical sales composure completely abandoned. We're not staying for this circus, she said, her voice carrying a sharp edge Jessica had never heard before. Marcus, get in the car, now. But Marcus remained seated, his teenage frame somehow seeming more solid, more grounded than his mother's desperate fidgeting. I'm not going anywhere until I understand what's happening. Jessica reached for her phone, her movements deliberate and calm. Detective Volkov should be here within the hour. I called him before the meeting started. Catherine's hand froze halfway to her purse strap. You called the police? I called them about potential document destruction and fraud. What I witnessed here today, you burning legal documents while confessing to manipulating a vulnerable adult, that constitutes destruction of evidence and admission of elder abuse. Jessica's voice carried the professional authority of someone who understood exactly which laws had been broken. Detective Volkov has been handling white-collar crime in Napa County for over 20 years. Hayes was studying the legal documents spread across Roberto's desk, his expression growing more troubled with each page. Catherine, these financial irregularities Jessica has documented. If even half of this is accurate, you're looking at serious federal charges. If it's accurate? Catherine's laugh came out sharp and desperate. William, you've known this family for decades. Are you really going to believe these accusations over the word of Roberto's grieving widow? I'm going to believe documentary evidence, forensic accounting reports, and recorded conversations, Hayes replied quietly, because that's what I'm looking at here. The sound of tires on gravel announced Detective Ray Volkoff's arrival. Through the window, Jessica could see the unmarked sedan pulling into the circular drive, its presence transforming the family confrontation into something official and irreversible. Volkoff was a bear of a man in his mid-40s, with the weathered face of someone who'd spent 20 years dealing with the complexities of wealthy families and their secrets. He'd investigated embezzlement cases involving tech executives, domestic violence among wine country aristocrats, and enough fraud schemes to recognize sophisticated manipulation when he saw it. Ms. Martinez, he nodded to Jessica as Hayes led him into the office. I understand there's been some document destruction and possible financial irregularities. Jessica gestured to the fireplace, where the ashes of Roberto's original will still smoldered. Mrs. Walsh Martinez burned what she claimed were outdated legal documents, but which I believe were authentic estate planning materials that contradicted her version of my father's final wishes. Volkov's experienced eyes took in the scene, the scattered financial documents, Catherine's defensive posture, Marcus's obvious distress, and Hayes's professional discomfort. Mrs. Walsh Martinez, I'll need to ask you some questions about the destroyed documents. Catherine straightened, attempting to reclaim some of her earlier composure. Detective, my stepdaughter is obviously distraught about her father's death. She's making wild accusations because she's unhappy with Roberto's final decisions about his estate. Wild accusations that include documented evidence of forged signatures, unauthorized financial transfers, and insurance fraud, Jessica interjected, indicating the papers spread across the desk. All of which I've been investigating with the help of forensic accountants for the past 6 months. Volkov moved to examine the documents, his expression growing more serious as he recognized the scope of what Jessica had compiled. These look like the kind of records that would interest federal authorities. Agent Sarah Chen from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division has already reviewed preliminary findings, Jessica confirmed. She's particularly interested in the pattern of targeting elderly cancer patients across multiple states. Catherine's face went white. I haven't targeted anyone. I provided care and companionship to vulnerable men who needed support. Men who consistently changed their wills to benefit you shortly before their deaths, Volkov said, reading from one of Jessica's documents. Men whose medical treatment you had access to through your pharmaceutical sales position. Marcus was staring at his mother with growing horror. Mom, is this true? About the other men? Catherine's composure cracked completely. Marcus, you don't understand. These men were alone, dying. I gave them comfort in their final months. You gave them false hope while systematically stealing their life savings, Jessica said flatly. Richard Pemberton's children have been trying to understand why their father cut them out of his will for 3 years. David Walsh's nephew still questions why his uncle married a woman he'd known for 6 weeks. Volkov was taking notes now, his experienced investigator instincts recognizing the elements of a complex federal case. Mrs. Walsh Martinez, I'm going to need you to come to the station for formal questioning. The destruction of legal documents in front of witnesses, combined with these financial irregularities, requires a full investigation. Catherine looked around the room desperately, seeing her carefully constructed world collapsing from every direction. The evidence was overwhelming, the witnesses were hostile, and law enforcement was treating her not as a grieving widow but as a criminal suspect. This is harassment, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. I haven't done anything illegal. Then you won't mind answering questions about your pharmaceutical sales territory, your access to patient information, and the timing of these financial transfers, Volkov replied evenly. And you certainly won't mind if we secure your financial records pending a federal investigation. Marcus stood slowly, his young face showing a maturity that seemed to have aged him years in the past hour. Detective Volkov, I want to tell you what I saw during Dad's final months. About Mom's behavior, about the documents she had him sign, about the conversations I overheard. Catherine stared at her son in shock, realizing that her ultimate betrayal wasn't just being exposed, it was being exposed by the child she'd claimed to be protecting through all her manipulations and lies. The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp October clarity that made Napa Valley famous, but the Martinez estate felt anything but peaceful. FBI agent Sarah Chen's black SUV pulled through the gates at precisely 9 a.m., followed by a forensic accounting van and a document analysis truck that transformed the elegant winery into the center of a federal investigation. Jessica stood on the front steps, watching the professional choreography of a major white-collar crime investigation unfold. Crime scene technicians unpacked equipment designed to analyze burned documents, while financial specialists wheeled computers and printers toward Roberto's office. The contrast between the federal resources and yesterday's family confrontation struck her with both satisfaction and sadness. This was justice, but it was also the final destruction of any pretense that the Martinez family might heal privately. Agent Sarah Chen emerged from the lead vehicle with the purposeful stride of someone who'd built dozens of elder abuse cases. At 34, she possessed the kind of focused intelligence that came from years of forensic accounting, combined with genuine empathy for vulnerable victims. Her personal experience with her grandmother's financial exploitation had driven her to specialize in cases exactly like this one. Ms. Martinez, Chen extended her hand with professional warmth. I've reviewed your preliminary materials. Your documentation is exceptionally thorough. Corporate fraud training, Jessica replied. I know how to follow money trails. Chen's smile carried approval. It shows. Your stepmother's pattern of behavior across multiple victims is textbook predatory elder abuse. What happened yesterday with the document destruction just gave us additional charges. Detective Volkov approached from the driveway, where he'd been coordinating with local law enforcement. Agent Chen, Mrs. Walsh-Martinez spent the night at our facility. She's requested an attorney and isn't talking. Expected, Chen nodded, but we have enough documentary evidence to proceed without her cooperation. Where's the son? Marcus is inside with his school counselor, Jessica said. He wants to help, but this is overwhelming for a 16-year-old. Chen's expression softened. I've interviewed dozens of family members in these cases. Kids often see more than adults realize, but they don't understand the significance until someone explains the legal implications. They moved into Roberto's office, where the previous day's confrontation had given way to systematic federal investigation. Forensic specialists were carefully collecting ash samples from the fireplace, while others photographed and cataloged every document Jessica had presented as evidence. The burned will fragments are yielding good results, reported Dr. Amanda Torres, the FBI's senior document analyst. We're seeing clear evidence of multiple ink types, different paper stocks, and what appears to be traced signatures overlaying authentic ones. Hayes sat in the corner, looking older than his 60 years, as he watched federal agents dissect 2 decades of legal work. Agent Chen, I need you to understand. I had no idea about Catherine's history when I helped with Roberto's estate modifications. Mr. Hayes, you're not under investigation, Chen assured him. Your cooperation and documentation of the suspicious circumstances actually strengthens our case considerably. She moved to the conference table where Jessica's months of investigation were now supplemented by federal resources. Bank records from multiple states, pharmaceutical industry employment files, and medical facility access logs painted a picture of systematic predation that went far beyond Roberto Martinez. Your stepmother's methodology was sophisticated, Chen explained to Jessica. She used her pharmaceutical sales territory to identify cancer patients with significant assets and limited family oversight. Her access to treatment schedules allowed her to time her interventions during periods of maximum vulnerability. Jessica studied the timeline Chen had constructed. How many victims? We've confirmed 5 over the past 8 years. Richard Pemberton in Sacramento, David Walsh in Stockton, Roberto here in Napa, and 2 others in Los Angeles County. Combined theft approaches $6 million. The number hit Jessica like a physical blow. $6 million stolen from dying men, their final wishes perverted by someone they'd trusted with their most vulnerable moments. Marcus appeared in the doorway, accompanied by his school counselor, Dr. Elizabeth Reyes. The teenager looked like he'd aged years overnight, his face showing the strain of choosing between family loyalty and moral truth. "Agent Chen?" His voice cracked slightly. "I want to tell you what I saw." Chen gestured to a chair, her manner shifting to the gentle professionalism she used with young witnesses. "Marcus, I know this is difficult. You're not in any trouble, and anything you tell me is to help us understand what happened to your father." Marcus sat carefully, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "Mom coached me on what to say if anyone asked about Dad's condition during his illness. She told me he was confused and upset about Jessica not visiting enough, and that's why he changed his will. But that wasn't what you observed?" "No." Marcus's voice grew stronger. "Dad talked about Jessica all the time. He was proud of her law career, worried that the winery business would interfere with her success. He wanted to leave her everything, because he said she understood both the emotional and practical sides of what he'd built." Chen made notes while maintaining eye contact with Marcus. "Did you witness your mother influencing your father's medical care?" Marcus nodded reluctantly. "She controlled his medications, said the doctors didn't understand his pain levels, that she knew better because she worked in pharmaceuticals. She'd adjust his doses without calling the doctor, especially before important conversations or when people were visiting." Jessica felt her chest tighten. Catherine had been drugging Roberto to maintain control over his decision-making capacity. "What about the will changes?" Chen asked gently. "I saw Mom practicing Dad's signature. She said she was helping him because his hands shook too much to write clearly." Marcus's voice broke slightly. "She made me practice too, in case I needed to help Dad with paperwork." The room fell silent except for the soft clicking of keyboards as FBI specialists documented Marcus's testimony. Chen's expression had hardened. Signature practice involving a minor added another dimension to the criminal conspiracy. "Marcus," Chen said carefully, "did your mother ever ask you to witness documents or sign anything yourself?" "She had me sign some papers she said were for Dad's medical insurance. But looking back," he paused, gathering courage, "I think they might have been bank documents. She told me not to read them, just to sign where she pointed." Chen exchanged glances with Jessica. If Catherine had involved Marcus in document fraud, she'd not only exploited a vulnerable adult, but corrupted a minor as well. Dr. Torres approached from the fireplace area, carrying evidence bags filled with ash samples and partially burned paper fragments. "Agent Chen, we've reconstructed enough of the original will to confirm it's substantially different from the version presented yesterday. The authentic document names Jessica Martinez as primary beneficiary, with specific provisions for the stepmother's financial security." Chen turned to Jessica, her expression mixing professional satisfaction with personal empathy. "Ms. Martinez, we have enough evidence for a federal indictment. Your stepmother is going to face serious prison time for this." Jessica looked around the room, at the federal agents building their case, at Marcus courageously testifying against his mother, at Hayes confronting his unwitting role in the fraud. Justice was being served, but at the cost of completely destroying what remained of her father's family. "What happens next?" she asked. "We arrest Catherine Walsh Martinez on federal charges of elder abuse, document forgery, financial fraud, and conspiracy. With her pattern of behavior across multiple victims, she's looking at 20 to 30 years in federal prison." The weight of those words settled over the room. Catherine's predatory career was ending, but the damage she'd inflicted on her victims' families would take years to heal. The arrest had been swift and professional. Catherine Walsh Martinez was taken into federal custody that afternoon, her polished composure finally cracking completely as FBI agents read charges that could keep her in prison for decades. But Agent Chen knew that building an airtight case required more than financial records and Marcus's testimony. She needed medical evidence to prove Roberto's diminished capacity during the crucial period when his will was allegedly changed. Dr. Patricia Hoffman's oncology practice occupied a modern building overlooking Napa Valley's rolling hills. its serene setting a stark contrast to the life and death battles fought within its walls. The 48-year-old physician had treated Roberto Martinez for over 2 years, watching him fight cancer with determination while slowly losing ground to both his disease and his wife's manipulations. Jessica sat beside Agent Chen in Dr. Hoffman's consultation room, surrounded by the same kind of awards and certifications that had lined her father's office. But where Roberto's achievements celebrated business success, these honored medical dedication and patient advocacy. Dr. Hoffman, Chen began, her voice carrying the respectful authority she used with professional witnesses. I understand you had concerns about Mr. Martinez's care during his final months. Dr. Hoffman's hands were steady as she opened Roberto's thick medical file, but Jessica caught the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested professional frustration and personal regret. I had significant concerns about the isolation Mrs. Martinez imposed on Roberto and her interference with his treatment protocols. Can you be more specific? Catherine insisted on controlling all communication between Roberto and his medical team. She answered questions directed at him, scheduled appointments without his input, and frequently changed his medication schedules without consulting me. Dr. Hoffman's clinical voice couldn't quite mask her anger. Most concerning was her insistence that Roberto was too confused to make his own medical decisions, when my examinations showed his cognitive function was largely intact. Chen made careful notes. What did your cognitive assessments reveal? Roberto scored consistently in the normal range on mental status exams throughout his treatment, even during periods of pain medication. His confusion seemed to correlate directly with Catherine's presence and her control over his medication timing. Dr. Hoffman pulled out a series of test results. When I met with Roberto alone, which Catherine tried to prevent, he was lucid, articulate, and deeply concerned about his relationship with his daughter. Jessica felt her throat tighten. Her father had been fighting not just cancer but systematic isolation from the people who loved him. Did Mr. Martinez ever express concerns about his wife's behavior? Chen asked. Dr. Hoffman hesitated, clearly weighing patient confidentiality against the need for justice. In April, during what turned out to be one of our last private conversations, Roberto asked me about the effects of his pain medications on legal decision-making. He was worried that he might have signed documents he didn't fully understand. The admission hung in the air like an indictment. Roberto had known something was wrong but had been too weakened by illness to fight Catherine's control effectively. What about his pain medication management? Chen continued. Marcus testified that Catherine adjusted dosages without medical supervision. That's a serious concern, Dr. Hoffman replied, her professional demeanor sharpening. Catherine had access to Roberto's prescription information through her pharmaceutical industry connections. She claimed expertise in pain management that exceeded her actual training, and I documented several instances where Roberto's reported symptoms didn't match his medication levels. She pulled out a detailed chart showing medication schedules versus Roberto's actual condition reports. See these discrepancies? Roberto would report being heavily sedated during periods when his prescribed dosage should have left him alert. But Catherine controlled the administration, claiming he needed additional medication for, quote, breakthrough pain. Jessica studied the timeline, seeing how Catherine's manipulation had intensified during the final months when Roberto's will was allegedly changed. Dr. Hoffman, did you ever see my father sign any legal documents? Not exactly, but I witnessed something disturbing in late September. Catherine brought what she claimed were insurance forms for Roberto to sign. His hand was shaking badly, not from his condition, but from what appeared to be over-medication. When I suggested we wait until his medication levels stabilized, Catherine became extremely agitated and insisted the papers were time-sensitive. Chen looked up from her notes. Did you see him actually sign these documents? I saw Catherine guide his hand through what appeared to be multiple signatures. Roberto seemed confused about what he was signing, asking repeatedly whether the papers were related to his medical treatment. Catherine kept reassuring him they were, quote, just insurance paperwork, but the documents were far too thick for standard medical forms. The evidence was damning. Catherine had systematically drugged Roberto into compliance, then used his impaired state to force him to sign documents he couldn't properly evaluate. Dr. Hoffman, Jessica said quietly, why didn't you report your suspicions? The oncologist's professional composure cracked slightly. I should have. I documented my concerns in Roberto's file, but I didn't fully understand the scope of what Catherine was doing. I thought she was overly protective, not criminally manipulative. She paused, gathering herself. When Roberto died, I assumed his family would handle his affairs appropriately. I had no idea Catherine was systematically stealing from him. Chen was reviewing her notes, connecting medical evidence to the broader fraud case. Doctor, in your professional opinion, was Roberto Martinez competent to make major financial decisions during the period when his will was allegedly changed? Based on my examinations and cognitive assessments, yes, Roberto retained the mental capacity to make informed decisions throughout his treatment. But his capacity was severely compromised by controlled access to information and manipulation of his medication schedule. Dr. Hoffman's voice carried the weight of professional certainty. If he had received appropriate medical care without interference, he would have been fully capable of understanding and directing his estate planning. Jessica felt a mixture of vindication and grief. Her father hadn't abandoned her or chosen Catherine over his biological daughter. He'd been systematically drugged and isolated until he couldn't resist Catherine's manipulation. Agent Chen was building toward her crucial question. Dr. Hoffman, would you be willing to testify that Catherine Walsh Martinez's interference with Roberto's medical care constituted a form of elder abuse? Absolutely. The response was immediate and firm. What Catherine did to Roberto, controlling his medications, isolating him from family, using his illness to manipulate his decision-making, represents textbook elder abuse. She exploited his vulnerability during the most frightening period of his life. Dr. Hoffman closed Roberto's file with deliberate care. I've been treating cancer patients for 15 years. I've seen families struggle with difficult decisions, watched people cope with loss and fear, but I've never seen someone systematically exploit a patient's illness for personal gain the way Catherine exploited Roberto. Chen was documenting the conversation with the systematic thoroughness that would be crucial in federal court. Doctor, we'll need your complete medical records, medication logs, and cognitive assessment results. This testimony will be critical in proving that Roberto's will changes were the result of systematic elder abuse rather than legitimate estate planning. As they prepared to leave Dr. Hoffman's office, Jessica realized that the medical evidence was the final piece needed to ensure Catherine's conviction. Her stepmother hadn't just forged documents and stolen money. She'd used her pharmaceutical knowledge to drug a dying man into compliance, turning his final months into a campaign of systematic exploitation. The federal case against Catherine Walsh Martinez was now airtight, built on financial evidence, witness testimony, and medical proof of elder abuse. But as Jessica drove back through Napa Valley's beautiful landscape, she couldn't shake the image of her father, confused, isolated, and fighting not just cancer but the woman who claimed to love him, desperately trying to protect his true wishes while his strength failed and his time ran out. The news of Catherine's arrest had spread through Napa Valley's elite social circles like wildfire, carrying with it the toxic mix of scandal and vindication that wealthy communities fed on. By the time Agent Chen arrived at St. Helena Preparatory Academy, Martinez was already dealing with the whispered conversations and sideways glances that followed federal investigations into prominent families. Jessica waited in the school's oak-paneled conference room, watching through tall windows as students moved between classes with the casual confidence that expensive education provided. She remembered her own time at similar institutions, where family reputation mattered as much as academic achievement, where scandal could isolate a student as effectively as any physical barrier. Marcus entered with Dr. Elizabeth Reyes, the school counselor who'd been helping him process the systematic destruction of everything he'd believed about his family. At 16, he possessed his father's thoughtful intelligence and his mother's striking features, but his eyes held a weariness that belonged to someone much older. "How are you holding up?" Jessica asked gently, noting the dark circles under his eyes and the way he carried himself like someone bracing for the next blow. "I don't know," Marcus replied honestly, sinking into one of the leather chairs that surrounded the conference table. "Everyone at school knows about Mom's arrest. The teachers are trying to be understanding, but my friends—" He shrugged, the gesture carrying the weight of social isolation that came with being the son of an accused federal criminal. Agent Chen entered with the careful professionalism she brought to all interactions with minor witnesses. Her experience with family fraud cases had taught her that children often suffered the most devastating consequences, caught between loyalty and truth with no good options available. Marcus, Chen said, settling into a chair across from him, I want to thank you for your honesty during yesterday's interview. Your testimony about your mother's behavior and your father's condition has been crucial to our investigation. Marcus nodded, but didn't meet her eyes. Is Mom really going to prison? The evidence suggests she'll face significant federal charges, Chen replied carefully. But right now, I need to talk to you about something else. We believe your mother may have involved you in document fraud without your knowledge. Dr. Reyes leaned forward, her counselor instincts recognizing the additional trauma this revelation would bring. Marcus, whatever happened, you were a minor. You're not in any legal trouble. What kind of document fraud? Marcus's voice was barely above a whisper. Chen opened a folder containing copies of bank documents and legal papers. We found several financial instruments with your signature on them dating back to when you were 14 and 15. Your mother claimed you were helping your father with paperwork because his hands shook too much to write clearly. Marcus stared at the documents, his face growing pale as memory and understanding collided. She said they were insurance forms, medical stuff that Dad needed help with because of his treatment. They weren't insurance forms, Jessica said gently. They were bank transfers, property deeds, and investment account changes. Your signature gave Catherine legal cover to move assets without triggering additional scrutiny from financial institutions. The silence that followed was broken only by the distant sounds of students changing classes. Marcus studied the papers with growing horror, recognizing his own careful teenage handwriting on documents that had helped steal his father's fortune. I helped her, he said finally, his voice cracking. I helped her steal from Dad. Dr. Reyes moved closer, her professional training guiding her response. Marcus, you were manipulated by an adult who exploited your trust and your love for your father. You're a victim here, not a perpetrator. But Marcus was shaking his head, tears starting to fall. I should have known. I should have asked more questions, read what I was signing. Dad trusted me to help him, and You were 14 years old being manipulated by a woman who'd spent years perfecting her techniques on vulnerable adults, Chen interrupted firmly. Your mother is a sophisticated criminal who used your natural desire to help your father as another tool in her fraud scheme. Jessica watched her half-brother struggle with guilt that belonged entirely to Catherine, not to the child she'd corrupted. Marcus, do you remember Mom ever coaching you about what to say if anyone asked about these documents? Marcus wiped his eyes, his emotional control wavering between teenage vulnerability and forced maturity. She said bank employees might ask questions about why I was signing papers for Dad. She told me to explain that his hands shook from chemotherapy, that I was just helping him write because the doctors said keeping him active and managing his affairs was good for his mental health. Another lie, Chen noted, making careful documentation of Catherine's manipulation techniques. Your father's cognitive assessments show he was perfectly capable of understanding and signing his own documents when not under the influence of controlled medication. The weight of systematic deception was settling over Marcus like a suffocating blanket. Everything he'd believed about his role in his father's care had been corrupted by Catherine's criminal enterprise. There's something else, Chen continued gently. We need to discuss your testimony at trial. The defense will likely try to portray your mother as a devoted caregiver who made mistakes in judgment rather than a calculating criminal. Your first-hand observations of her behavior could be crucial in proving the systematic nature of her abuse. Marcus looked between Jessica and Chen, understanding the full scope of what was being asked of him. You want me to testify against Mom in federal court. We want you to tell the truth about what you witnessed, Jessica corrected. But Marcus, this is your choice. No one can force you to testify, and whatever you decide, you'll be protected and supported. Dr. Reyes squeezed Marcus's shoulder. You don't have to decide today. This is an enormous burden for someone your age. But Marcus was staring at the forged documents with his signature, seeing his unwitting participation in his father's exploitation with painful clarity. If I testify, what happens to Mom? Chen's expression remained carefully neutral. Your testimony would be one piece of evidence among many. The financial records, medical documentation, and pattern of behavior across multiple victims will determine the outcome more than any single witness. But it would help convict her? It would help establish the truth about what happened to your father during his final months. Marcus sat quietly for several minutes, weighing loyalty against justice, family bonds against moral obligation. The decision would define not just Catherine's fate, but his own understanding of right and wrong, truth and manipulation. "She made me practice Dad's signature," he said finally, his voice steady despite the tears on his cheeks. "She said it was so I could help him sign cards and letters when his hands were too shaky. But now I think she was preparing me to help forge his name on documents." The admission settled over the room like a final verdict. Catherine hadn't just exploited her dying husband and stolen from his daughter. She'd corrupted her own son, turning him into an unwitting accomplice in systematic elder abuse. "I'll testify," Marcus said, his voice carrying a determination that seemed to age him before their eyes. "Dad deserves the truth, even if it means everyone will know what Mom really is." Agent Chen nodded with professional respect for the courage it took a 16-year-old to choose truth over comfortable lies. "Marcus, you're doing the right thing. Your father would be proud of the man you're becoming." As they prepared to leave St. Helena Prep, Jessica realized that Marcus's decision to testify wasn't just about justice for Roberto. It was about breaking free from Catherine's manipulation and reclaiming his own moral agency. The boy who'd been used as a tool in his mother's criminal enterprise was choosing to become the young man who would help expose her crimes. Catherine's federal defense attorney, David Brennan, was the kind of lawyer wealthy families hired when scandal threatened to destroy their carefully constructed worlds. His Beverly Hills office specialized in white-collar crime, and his reputation for aggressive tactics had kept dozens of corporate executives and socialite criminals out of federal prison. But as he reviewed the evidence against Catherine Walsh Martinez, even his considerable experience couldn't find gaps in the prosecution's case. "The financial records are devastating," Brennan told Catherine during their consultation at the federal detention facility. "The pattern across multiple victims, the medical evidence of elder abuse, your son's testimony about signature practice, this isn't a case we can win at trial." Catherine sat across from him in the sterile interview room, her designer clothes replaced by federal detention orange, her pharmaceutical sales polish replaced by something desperate and calculating. "Then we don't let it get to trial. There have to be ways to pressure witnesses, to make them reconsider their testimony." Brennan's expression hardened. "Mrs. Walsh Martinez, I need to be very clear about something. Any attempt to influence witnesses will result in additional federal charges and the termination of my representation. Is that understood?" But Catherine's mind was already moving past legal constraints to the kind of direct action that had served her throughout her predatory career. She'd built her success on identifying pressure points and exploiting them ruthlessly. The federal system might limit her options, but it didn't eliminate them entirely. "What about Marcus?" she asked. "He's still my son. Surely there are legal protections for family communications." "Monitored communications only," Brennan replied. "And any attempt to coach his testimony or threaten him would constitute witness tampering, which carries an additional 5 to 10 years in federal prison." 2 days later, Marcus received a call from his mother's attorney requesting a family meeting. Jessica accompanied him to Brennan's San Francisco office, where Catherine waited with the careful composure of someone who'd practiced her approach meticulously. "Marcus, honey," Catherine's voice carried the maternal warmth she'd perfected over years of manipulation. "I know this has been confusing for you, but I need you to understand what's really happening here." Marcus sat stiffly beside Jessica, his 16-year-old frame radiating tension as he faced the mother who'd corrupted his love for his father into a tool for criminal fraud. "I understand perfectly, Mom. I helped you steal from Dad because you lied to me about what I was signing." Catherine's mask slipped slightly, revealing frustration at Marcus's unexpected resistance. "You helped your father manage his affairs during a difficult illness. Jessica is twisting normal family caregiving into something criminal because she's bitter about Roberto's final decisions." "Jessica didn't twist anything," Marcus replied, his voice steady despite the emotional weight of confronting his mother. "Agent Chen showed me the documents I signed. They weren't insurance forms. They were bank transfers and property deeds that helped you steal millions of dollars." Catherine leaned forward, her pharmaceutical sales training automatically adjusting her approach. "Marcus, you don't understand how the legal system works. Prosecutors lie to witnesses, especially young people, to get them to say what they want to hear. They're using you to hurt me. Jessica watched Catherine's technique with professional fascination. The subtle shifts in tone, the calculated vulnerability, the way she positioned herself as the victim while simultaneously manipulating her son's protective instincts. They're not using me, Mom. They're asking me to tell the truth about what I saw during Dad's final months. Marcus's voice carried a maturity that seemed to surprise even him. About how you controlled his medications, isolated him from Jessica, and coached me to help forge his signature. Catherine's composure cracked completely. You ungrateful little, she caught herself, realizing that losing control would only confirm everything Marcus was saying about her manipulative nature. Brennan intervened quickly. Perhaps we should end this meeting. But Catherine wasn't finished. The federal charges, the overwhelming evidence, and now her own son's betrayal had pushed her past the careful calculation that had defined her criminal career. Marcus, if you testify against me, you'll lose everything, she said, her voice carrying a threat that made Jessica's legal instincts flare with alarm. Your college trust fund, your private school tuition, the house you've lived in for 6 years, all of it depends on Roberto's estate remaining intact. If Jessica gets control of the money, do you really think she'll take care of you? Jessica felt her chest tighten with anger. Catherine, I would never. Wouldn't you? Catherine's eyes glittered with desperate cunning. You've spent months building a case to destroy his mother. What makes Marcus think you won't abandon him once you get what you want? Marcus stared at his mother with growing horror. You're threatening me. You're actually threatening your own son to keep him from testifying. I'm protecting you from making a mistake that will ruin your future, Catherine replied, but her voice carried the sharp edge of someone whose back was against the wall. Brennan was already standing, recognizing that his client had just committed witness tampering in front of multiple witnesses. This meeting is over. Mrs. Walsh-Martinez, we need to discuss the significant legal implications of what just happened. But Catherine was beyond caring about additional charges. Her pharmaceutical sales career had taught her that when normal persuasion failed, pressure and intimidation often succeeded. She'd used those techniques on dying men, vulnerable families, and now she was trying to use them on her own son. Think carefully, Marcus, she said as the guards prepared to escort her back to her cell. Family is everything. When Jessica gets bored with playing your protective big sister, when the novelty of having a little brother wears off, you'll be alone. I'm the only family you really have. As they left Brennan's office, Jessica realized that Catherine's desperation had just provided the prosecution with additional evidence of her manipulative and criminal nature. But more importantly, it had shown Marcus the true cost of loyalty to someone who would weaponize even maternal love to protect her criminal enterprise. The woman who'd spent years exploiting vulnerable people had finally revealed the depths of her corruption to the one person who'd never seen her clearly, her own son. The federal courthouse in San Francisco stood like a monument to institutional justice, its granite facade and soaring columns designed to inspire both respect and fear in those who entered seeking resolution through law. Jessica Martinez walked up those steps on a crisp December morning, 6 months after Catherine's arrest, carrying the weight of her father's vindication and her family's destruction in equal measure. The courtroom was packed with journalists, victims' families, and legal observers drawn by the complexity of Catherine Walsh-Martinez's criminal enterprise. 5 families had been destroyed by her systematic predation, but today's proceedings would focus primarily on Roberto Martinez's case, where the evidence was most comprehensive and the manipulation most thoroughly documented. Judge Patricia Hawkins presided with the stern competence of someone who'd spent 15 years adjudicating white-collar crime. She understood the sophisticated nature of elder abuse cases and the particular cruelty involved in exploiting vulnerable patients during their final months of life. Catherine sat at the defense table in a conservative navy suit, her pharmaceutical sales polish restored but unable to mask the haunted look of someone facing decades in federal prison. Her attorney, David Brennan, had negotiated the best plea arrangement possible, but even with cooperation, the charges were too severe, and the evidence too overwhelming for anything approaching leniency. Ms. Walsh-Martinez, Judge Hawkins began, her voice carrying the formal authority of federal justice. You have pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit wire fraud, elder abuse, document forgery, and witness tampering. Before I impose sentence, is there anything you wish to say? Catherine stood slowly, her hands trembling slightly, as she faced the families whose lives she'd destroyed. For a moment, Jessica thought she might see genuine remorse, some acknowledgement of the systematic cruelty she'd inflicted on dying men and their families. Your Honor, Catherine's voice carried the practiced sincerity of her pharmaceutical sales training. I want to apologize to everyone affected by my poor judgment during what was an extremely difficult period in my life. Poor judgment. Even now, facing 25 years in federal prison, Catherine couldn't bring herself to acknowledge the calculated nature of her crimes. I was overwhelmed by caring for Roberto during his illness, and I made financial decisions that I now realize were inappropriate. I never intended to cause harm to his family or to exploit his condition. Judge Hawkins's expression remained impassive, but Jessica caught the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested professional skepticism. Judges who specialized in white-collar crime had heard every possible variation of the poor judgment defense. Assistant U.S. Attorney Sarah Chen rose to present the government's evidence of systematic predation spanning 8 years and 5 victims. Her methodical presentation painted a picture of sophisticated criminal enterprise that went far beyond poor judgment or caregiver stress. Your Honor, the defendant's crimes represent calculated exploitation of vulnerable adults during the most frightening periods of their lives. She used her pharmaceutical industry access to identify wealthy cancer patients, then systematically isolated them from family support while manipulating their medication schedules to impair their decision-making capacity. Chen presented financial records showing the scope of Catherine's theft. Over $6 million stolen from dying men who'd trusted her with their most vulnerable moments. The pattern was undeniable. Whirlwind romance, isolation from family, medication manipulation, forged documents, and convenient death, leaving Catherine as primary beneficiary. The defendant didn't just steal money, Your Honor. She stole these men's final months with their families, their dignity, and their ability to direct their own legacy according to their true wishes. When Marcus was called to testify, he walked to the witness stand with the careful composure of someone who'd spent months preparing for this moment. At 16, he possessed a moral clarity that contrasted sharply with his mother's continued denials and manipulation. Marcus, Chen asked gently, can you tell the court what you witnessed regarding your adoptive father's care during his final illness? Marcus's voice was steady despite the weight of testifying against his mother. My mom controlled Dad's medications and scheduled them so he'd be confused during important conversations. She coached me to help with what she said were insurance forms, but which I now know were bank documents and property transfers. Did your mother ever ask you to practice signatures? She had me practice Dad's signature, saying it was to help him sign cards when his hands shook. But I think she was preparing me to help forge his name on legal documents. Catherine's face remained impassive, but Jessica caught the slight flinch when her own son described her systematic corruption of his love for his father. Dr. Patricia Hoffman's testimony provided the medical foundation for elder abuse charges. Her detailed records showed Roberto's cognitive competence despite Catherine's claims of confusion, the correlation between medication timing and mental clarity, and the systematic isolation from family and medical team. In my professional opinion, Dr. Hoffman stated clearly, Roberto Martinez was systematically drugged and isolated to impair his decision-making capacity. This represents textbook elder abuse through medical manipulation. Attorney William Hayes provided crucial testimony about the original will versus the forged documents Catherine had burned. His discomfort was evident as he described being pressured to handle suspicious paperwork, but his professional integrity demanded truth over loyalty to a client who'd exploited his services. The original will naming Jessica Martinez as primary beneficiary was authentic, Hayes testified. The documents Catherine presented were inconsistent with Roberto's expressed wishes and my 20 years of legal service to the Martinez family. When the victim impact statements began, Jessica found herself struggling with complex emotions. She spoke about losing not just her inheritance, but her father's final months to Catherine's manipulation. the systematic isolation that prevented proper goodbyes, and the corruption of family relationships that would take years to heal. Catherine didn't just steal money, Jessica told the court. She stole my father's dignity, his autonomy, and his ability to show love for his family according to his true values. She turned his final months into a criminal enterprise while making him complicit in betraying the daughter he'd raised to believe in justice and truth. Other families affected by Catherine's predation shared similar stories: elderly fathers isolated from children, final wishes perverted by forged documents, loving relationships destroyed by systematic manipulation during the most vulnerable period of their lives. Judge Hawkins listened to each statement with the careful attention these cases demanded, understanding that Catherine's crimes went far beyond financial theft to encompass fundamental violations of trust, dignity, and family bonds. Ms. Walsh-Martinez, the judge said finally, your crimes represent a particularly cruel form of predation. You exploited dying men during their most vulnerable moments, corrupted a minor child to assist in your criminal enterprise, and systematically destroyed family relationships for personal gain. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Hawkins prepared to impose sentence on someone whose sophisticated criminal enterprise had devastated multiple families across several years. The court sentences you to 25 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. You will pay full restitution to all victims, surrender all assets obtained through criminal activity, and have no contact with any family members of your victims without court supervision. 25 years. Catherine would be 67 when released. Her predatory career permanently ended. Her victims finally receiving the justice they deserved through institutional rather than personal vengeance. The Martinez winery looked different in the golden light of harvest season. 8 months after Catherine's sentencing, the federal restitution process had been complex but thorough. Every asset Catherine had stolen or obtained through fraud had been returned to its rightful owners. Jessica stood on the terrace overlooking the vineyards her father had cultivated for 30 years, watching workers move between the rows with the efficient choreography of people who understood both the science and artistry of winemaking. Marcus emerged from the main house carrying 2 glasses of Roberto's 2018 Cabernet Sauvignon, the vintage that had won the winery its most prestigious award. At 17, he'd grown into his frame and found a confidence that came from surviving the worst kind of family betrayal and choosing truth over comfortable lies. Agent Chen called, he said, handing Jessica the wine. Catherine's appeals were denied. The conviction stands. Jessica nodded, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Justice had been served, but at the cost of completely destroying what remained of her father's family. Catherine would spend the next 25 years in federal prison, her sophisticated criminal enterprise permanently dismantled. How do you feel about it? Jessica asked, studying her half-brother's face for signs of the complex emotions that came with seeing your mother imprisoned for systematic elder abuse. Marcus was quiet for a moment, swirling the wine as he'd watched Roberto do countless times during harvest tastings. I feel like Dad can finally rest, he said eventually, like his true wishes are finally being honored instead of perverted by someone who claimed to love him. The federal court had appointed Jessica as the estate's administrator, a process that involved untangling 3 years of Catherine's financial manipulation and restoring Roberto's assets to their intended distribution. The work had been methodical and sometimes painful, revealing the full scope of how systematically Catherine had perverted Roberto's final wishes. I've been thinking about the education trust Dad established for you, Jessica said. The $2 million Catherine tried to hide. It's been fully restored with interest, but I want to discuss how you'd like to use it. Marcus smiled, the expression transforming his face from serious teenager to someone who'd found a genuine peace with his father's memory. I want to study law, corporate fraud investigation. Specifically, after watching what you did to build the case against Mom, I realized there are probably other families out there dealing with sophisticated financial abuse. Jessica felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with family obligation and everything to do with genuine respect for the young man Marcus was becoming. Following in your father's footsteps by supporting justice and protecting vulnerable people, he would be incredibly proud. They walked through the winery's production facility, where the 2025 harvest was being processed according to Roberto's traditional methods. Jessica had made the decision to honor her father's winemaking philosophy, while modernizing the business operations he'd sometimes neglected in favor of perfectionist attention to grape quality. The Roberto Martinez Foundation for Elder Protection is officially launching next month, Jessica said, stopping beside the fermentation tanks where Roberto had spent countless hours perfecting his craft. We're using the restitution money from Catherine's victims to fund legal advocacy, medical oversight, and family education programs. The foundation had been Jessica's way of transforming her father's victimization into protection for other vulnerable adults. Working with Agent Chen and Dr. Hoffman, they developed comprehensive programs to identify and prevent the kind of sophisticated elder abuse Catherine had perfected. "I want to be involved," Marcus said, "not just as a beneficiary but as someone who understands how predators exploit family relationships and medical vulnerability." William Hayes approached from the main house, carrying legal documents that had become routine in the months of asset recovery and estate restoration. At 61, the family attorney had found unexpected purpose in helping undo the damage Catherine's manipulation had caused to his 20-year relationship with the Martinez family. "The final insurance settlements have been processed," Hayes reported. "Catherine's fraudulent medical claims have been reversed, and the legitimate expenses from Roberto's care have been properly documented." He paused, studying the legal papers with the careful attention that had defined his professional service to the Martinez family. "Jessica, there's something else. We found additional documents in Roberto's safe deposit box, materials Catherine never knew existed." Hayes handed her a sealed envelope with Roberto's handwriting, "For Jessica when the truth finally comes out." Inside were letters Roberto had written during his final months, documenting his growing awareness of Catherine's manipulation and his desperate attempts to protect his true wishes from her influence. The letters revealed a man fighting not just cancer, but systematic isolation and medication manipulation, trying to preserve his legacy and his daughter's inheritance. "My dearest Jessica," one letter began, "if you're reading this, then Catherine's deception has finally been exposed. I want you to know that despite the confusion she created, I never stopped loving you or believing in your strength and integrity. The will she's been altering isn't my true testament. My real wishes are with William Hayes, properly witnessed and legally unassailable." Jessica read through her father's careful documentation of Catherine's abuse, his growing understanding of her systematic manipulation, and his pride in his daughter's legal career and moral character. The letters revealed that Roberto had retained more awareness than anyone realized, fighting Catherine's control even as his physical strength failed. "He knew," Marcus said quietly, reading over Jessica's shoulder. "Dad knew what Mom was doing, even when she thought she had him completely under control." Another letter addressed Marcus directly. "My son, you have been the greatest joy of my final years. Your mother's choices do not reflect on the man you're becoming. Trust Jessica to guide you, and remember that real love doesn't require manipulation or control. It celebrates the authentic person you choose to become." The documents included Roberto's authentic signature samples, medication schedules he'd secretly maintained, and even audio recordings made when Catherine thought he was too sedated to function independently. The evidence painted a picture of a dying man fighting to protect his family from someone who exploited his illness for personal gain. Dr. Patricia Hoffman arrived for the Foundation's planning meeting, her medical expertise crucial to developing prevention programs for other families facing similar manipulation. Her experience with Roberto's case had motivated her to establish protocols for identifying and reporting suspected elder abuse in medical settings. "The education component is essential," Dr. Hoffman explained, spreading out program materials on the tasting room table. "Families need to understand the warning signs: isolation from support systems, medication manipulation, sudden changes in legal documents during illness, and financial irregularities that coincide with medical vulnerability." Agent Sarah Chen joined them via video conference from San Francisco, her ongoing work with the FBI's Elder Abuse Unit providing national perspective on the Foundation's mission. Catherine's case had become a textbook example of sophisticated predation, used in federal training programs for investigators and prosecutors. "We're seeing similar cases across the country," Chen reported. "People with medical industry access targeting vulnerable patients, using their professional knowledge to facilitate systematic exploitation. The Martinez case has helped us develop better detection methods and prosecution strategies. As the afternoon progressed, Jessica found herself surrounded by people who'd chosen to transform Roberto's victimization into protection for others. Marcus, dedicating his education to fraud investigation, Dr. Hoffman developing medical protocols, Hayes providing legal expertise, and Chen training federal investigators. C.A. Theron's attempt to destroy the Martinez family legacy had instead created a network of professionals committed to preventing similar crimes. Marcus stood beside his father's portrait in the tasting room, studying the confident smile of a man who'd built something meaningful from nothing. Jessica, I've been thinking about what Mom said during that last meeting, about you abandoning me once you got what you wanted. Jessica felt her chest tighten, remembering Catherine's manipulative attempt to turn Marcus against her through threats and false predictions. She was wrong about everything else, Marcus continued, but I wanted you to know. Even if she'd been right, even if you had just wanted the inheritance, I still would have testified. Because what she did to Dad was wrong, regardless of what happened to me afterward. The statement revealed the moral courage that had defined Marcus throughout the investigation, his willingness to choose truth over personal security, justice over family loyalty. At 17, he possessed an integrity that Catherine's manipulation had failed to corrupt. As the sun set over Napa Valley's rolling hills, Jessica realized that Catherine's systematic destruction of their family had ultimately revealed its true foundation. The bonds between her and Marcus weren't based on shared genetics or legal inheritance. They were built on mutual respect, honest communication, and commitment to honoring Roberto's authentic values. Dad's real legacy isn't the winery or the money, Jessica said, watching the light fade over the vineyards Roberto had loved. It's the choice to build something meaningful, to protect people who can't protect themselves, and to choose truth over comfortable lies.